gozaimasu. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm honored, Gillian. Thank you for joining us. This is we've got, a whole huge suite of topics. And it's interesting, in my little world of finance and investment, over the last, 6 months, there's 3 definite topics. The first one, of course, is that Trump. The second one, of course, is AI. And the third one is actually Japan. Japan as the voice of reason, a society that actually is working, that is not descending into chaos, a society where, according to your trust barometer, the trust in Japanese corporations around the world is now #1. So Pax Nipponica is a reality, while the 2 big guys, America and China, are fighting it out. Now, let's delve into the topic, Trump and AI, and let's lay the scene. I think, Margot, you're in a fantastic position because talk to us a little bit about trust.
Absolutely. Can you guys all hear me? Amazing. Thank you so much for that tee up. And hi, everybody. I'm Margot Edelman. I lead the technology practice for Edelman in the US. So this is definitely a topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So I think I'll just open by giving some stats from our 2025 Trust Barometer. For those of you who don't know, the Edelman Trust Barometer is something that we've done for 25 years. And it looks at the state of trust in business, government, media, and NGOs really around the world. So we had some very interesting findings this year, in particular that what we saw is a rise of grievance. And what do we mean by grievance? People who are upset with the system. They believe the system is not working for them. They don't believe that their family is going to be better off 5 years from now than today. They are worried about fear of job loss due to automation. They fear that they won't have the skills to compete in the future. And so what that is leading to is feeling that the system is not working for them. 4 out of 10 respondents globally said they actually support hostile activism, which means taking action, negative action online. It actually even means physical violence. And that's even stronger among people who are ages 18 to 24. In that group, 6 out of 10 actually say they support hostile activism. And so we did this data research in the fall, and we really think that in some ways it really set the stage for what was to come in the United States with the election and a lot of what we're seeing now around the continued rise of populism with the Trump administration. Conversely, on the technology side, which I know is sort of the other aspect of this around AI, there is a lot of fear around AI as well, especially in the developed world. So while trust in technology remains high globally, trust in AI actually really varies depending on where in the world you are. So, for example, in India, in China, trust in AI is around 70 points. However, in the United States and other developing countries, trust in AI stands around 30 points. So a big, big gap. So for those of you who have AI companies, for those of you who are incorporating AI into your companies, especially if you are in the developed world, you are working from a place where people fear, in some ways, what you're doing. And grievance only heightens fear of AI. Among those who feel aggrieved, they are actually much less likely to trust AI than those who are not aggrieved, than those who trust the system. So just some interesting findings to lay the groundwork for our conversation.
Excellent. Gillian, if I could pull you into the conversation, you just heard some of the statistics there. I know you've got some very good thoughts on the role of AI sort of going forward, but please, your kickoff.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, it's great to be part of this panel, and I very much admire what you're doing in pulling together this conversation. And I particularly admire the fact that this is emanating from Japan, because as someone who spent many years of my life in Japan and dealt with the era of so-called Japan passing, I can tell you that right now it's not just a question of Pax Japonica, as Jesper says, but in many ways, Japan is rising into what is arguably its most important and potentially inspirationally strategic position that it's been in for many, many, many years. And you can see that in so many areas, not just geopolitically, but in terms of its critical role in many of the digital supply chains and robotics and the wafer section, but also in things like its foresight in having stockpiled critical minerals as a result of its conflict with China back in 2010, in a way that, frankly, America needs to learn from and is shameful in not having learned from before. When it comes to the issue of trust in AI, I take a slightly different perspective from some people because I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist. And what an anthropologist does is study social systems, not just in non-Western, seemingly exotic areas. And by the way, I put exotic in quotation marks because everybody seems exotic to somebody else. I seem exotic to other people sometimes. But anthropologists both look at social systems as a whole. They try to look bottom up at how people are actually behaving. They try to look at the parts of the world that we both like to highlight and talk about, but also which we don't talk about. And they look at the gap between what people say they do and what they actually do. And there's been a series of ethnographic studies looking at Gen Z in particular and how they're behaving in relation to AI and tech. And that reveals that notwithstanding this expression of concern to pollsters, Gen Z is actually acting as if it trusted AI almost every day. And both some of the research and polls and the anthropology observations suggest that Gen Z often trusts AI bots more than human authority figures in fields like medicine, finance, and in the corporate sphere. There's a survey out recently suggesting that 30% of Gen Z prefer to have an AI bot as a manager than a human being. And in my view, that reflects two key social trends that have been building for a long time but are accelerating now. Firstly, that trust is shifting from being on a vertical axis to being a horizontal axis. And by that I mean that whereas in the 20th century people were trained to trust authority figures like CEOs and journalists and government officials, now they increasingly trust their peer group via digital platforms. And the way that people are treating AI on their phones and in other lived experiences is seen as an extension of the online crowd, not as an authority figure on top. Because AI is encountered on people's phones in a very intimate way, literally in their hands, almost every day. The second key point is that we're also seeing the rise of what I call Gen P, Generation Pick and Mix, that is all about taking our experience in the consumer life, where we're used to pick and mixing almost anything we want all the time in a customized way, whether it's our coffee choices, whether it's our music choices, whether it's our media choices, we're extrapolating that into almost every area of our life. And one of the reasons why we like AI in terms of our lived experience is that AI flatters us by being the ultimate customization tool. It appears to reflect and mirror our personalized desires, and that reinforces the way that AI works. So those big social trends, in my view, are underpinning our attitude towards AI. This, in terms of our lived experience, this creates enormous dangers and risks about blind trust in AI, but it also, surprisingly, I think, contains the seeds of some potentially very beneficial developments in the future if we react to this mindfully. And if you want, Jesper, I can talk about how I see both the dangers and the potential benefits later on.
Excellent. So, it's wise words, and thank you very much, Gillian, for that. So it's actually, it was a year ago, the top wise word, that we are excellent at communicating from the few to the many, but we haven't figured out how to communicate from the many to the many. And that's what Gillian just addressed, right, with this shift in terms of vertical communication versus horizontal communication, plus this kicker that, hey, it's me who is at the center of the attention here. Now, Alex, this was the trust and AI bit. What about the Trump bit? Can I put you on the spot and tell us a little bit? We've got this revolution that's going on, and obviously AI, if you look at it from a historic perspective, is this industrial revolution that affects all sectors. The robotics revolution affected manufacturing. AI, whether you run a yoga studio or a bank, it is going to affect every aspect of the economy here. Now, where does Trump and America come into this discussion? Alex, what are your observations in terms of, you've lived in and worked in America, you've dealt with all the powerful CEOs here in America. What's the shift that's occurring right now?
Well, that's a massive ask. Yep. Well, first, thanks. I appreciate the chance to be with you, and I look forward to the follow-up discussions, because this is one where no one person has the answer, except someone who thinks he does. But let me just say that this is clearly, at the highest level, a 100-year storm, right? If you define trust as reliability and predictability, this is in counter to anything that means. But what if I told you this is not about trust, it's about truth? The truth is that there are a lot of interdependencies that remain, regardless of what's happening on the geopolitical product goods side. What if I told you that the biggest part of the world's economy is non-tradable goods? What happens in small and medium businesses? What if I told you that the surpluses in digital services that the United States has is probably a part of a bargaining chip in the future? So whatever's happening here, there will be winners and losers. There is always opportunity and disruption. So I'm hoping that during the discussion, we also talk about where are the pockets of opportunity from a venture investing side, from a rationalizing your portfolio side, from a fixing your global supply chain side. These are all topics that my colleagues, my clients around the world are asking themselves. But that doesn't mean that this is not indeed quite traumatic. One of the quotes that I've recycled from other contagions or crises over the years, financial and otherwise, is this quote that a CEO gave me once in 1998 during the Asian credit crisis. He said, "My 5-year plan is to survive the next 6 months." I think you've heard that, right? Well, these days it's probably more about 6 weeks in tariff negotiations, or maybe 6 hours, as is going on now with the Japan-US bilateral discussions and negotiations. So even before we get to trust and truth, the people that are trying to make sense of this, heads of state, CEOs, boards of directors, they had a very tough time even before the last 6 months. The CEO tenures have come down. You had to embed advanced analytics and AI into strategic global scenarios, having supply chains that are modern and digital, having sustainability and energy transition. These are all very tough things already, and this has become an accelerant to how you manage that. So, I mean, one of the things I would note is that you can't just be defensive. How do you find a way to be offensive and be a winner in an environment of chaotic, unknown unknowns? Because that's not going to change. So hoping that the world will go back is not a solution. I think Margot's research points out that this is 100 years, perhaps, of structural anger, inequity, and resentment against alliances, agreements, not being able to take care of our own people, having our own jobs, our own control over our own economic destiny. So I think I've seen good companies, I think companies that will win, and countries, for that matter, take a much more of a time-phased approach to this, because the solution cycle is going to be longer than the political cycle. And the political cycles, as you know, in the United States in particular, and less so in Japan and other places, but it's basically less than 2 years. We're going to have a tax and budget deficit discussion pretty soon. There'll be more trauma on the legislative side, but you have to focus on, well, what do we do right now? What do we do in the long, long term? You'll see a lot of fancy analyses from bankers and consultants talking about the perfect world maybe 10 years from now. But the winners and losers, from my experience and my company's experience, has been the people that can navigate the sort of current urgency and make some middle decisions. How do you look for new suppliers and certify them? How do you get suppliers, for example, on the tariff question, to absorb the duties? How do you actually export and develop alliances with some of your partners or even your customers to weather the economic storm here? So all I can say is, I mean, the disruption is real. That's the truth. It's a little bit of a law of the jungle, as some other commentators have said. You can only rely on your own national defense system. Steel and shipbuilding, sound familiar? These are things that I think a country like Japan has, you said, a lot going for it. In the current negotiations, there's probably a lot of opportunity to bolster that with the help of the United States, for example, and invest in the services sector, invest in S&B sector, things like that. So I think there's opportunity within the disruption, if I can leave it at that. Jesper.
The permanent optimist, I love it. But look, you know, this is a almost perfect storm, you know, in the sense that you've got a technological revolution that disrupts at very, very unprecedented speeds, right? But then at the political level, the reality of the world is the global economy is $100 trillion. The United States of America is $30 trillion. The People's Republic of China is $20 trillion. And the rest, Germany, $4 trillion, Japan, $4 trillion, India, $4 trillion, right? So you've got obviously these two hyperpowers, and the stable hyperpower, the United States of America, has now broken, or is in the process of breaking, all the covenants, because the way you engage, whether you're an American company or whether you're a Japanese company or a Chinese company or a Mexican company, a global company, the trust and the old way of doing business is being broken up. Move fast and break things is something that Silicon Valley does. But if a nation, the anchor nation of the world, starts to move fast and break things, today I tweet that the negotiations with Japan go well. Tomorrow I tweet that I hate the way Japan does X, Y, Z. What am I supposed to do? How do you navigate this storm, which, you know, is, and it's one of the nice things about Donald Trump. It's the greatest thing. We can now blame everything on Donald Trump, which is always very useful when you know who the bad guy is. But the reality is that obviously there's a tone that is being set. And that breaking of trust, of not being reliable, will you follow through on your actions? Help me. How do I navigate this?
That's a great question. And I think the biggest issue right now, as you said very wisely, is just the uncertainty that every business faces today. There's a huge amount of uncertainty as to what's going to come next. And then therefore it's very hard to make decisions when you have that level of uncertainty. I would also say, in addition to, of course, the technology revolution, I think there are a couple other ones that have come through. The first is sort of the pivot away from stakeholder capitalism. Mm-hmm. You know, for a long time, the consensus, of course, was that it's not just shareholders. It's about the community. It's about your employees. It's about promoting ESG. It's about promoting, especially in the United States, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these are norms that have been, you know, not just sort of slightly pivoted away from. They've been sort of, you know, the government, led by the government, US has done a complete 180 against a lot of these norms. And then, of course, as you said, sort of there's the shakeup of the global order and the decoupling, not just of the US and China, but the US, frankly, from a lot of the rest of the world, including Europe. So there's a huge amount of change, of course, in addition to the change from AI. For business, and again, I think, obviously the environment we're in, especially with the tariffs, is one that's really unprecedented. But I think overall for business, the recommendation on a communication side would be to still act, but of course, in the interest of the business. So, for example, instead of talking about sustainability, you talk about energy efficiency. And of course, then with energy efficiency, you're saving money. Or instead of talking about sort of overall, diversity commitments, you're talking about the benefit to the customer, getting to know the customer better, having an employee base that understands and reflects the customer. So I think, again, it's not necessarily completely changing the way that you run your business, but in some ways it's reframing how you speak about these things to really talk about it in the context of the benefit to the business and what it means for the bottom line versus talking about it as necessarily something that is pro-society.
Right.
So I think that's overall, at least from a communication standpoint, how to navigate this environment.
Right, excellent. Gillian, if I may bring you in, what's your take on the new style of government that Mr. Trump and his team is bringing to the world?
Well, I think the best way to understand it is to think about the court of King Henry VIII during the Tudor period in England, or Louis XIV in Versailles in France, because essentially it's a model of governance which is very familiar to anthropologists because it's occurred in many, many settings, but generally hasn't been dominant in 20th century Western world, whereby you essentially have a king, if you like, or an emperor, who operates by having courtiers around him who compete for his favor, and the level of power the courtiers have depends less on any kind of bureaucratic power structure or organogram or chart, and much more on their actual physical proximity and, if you like, their personal proximity, their friendship with the president. And those courtiers right now, many of them have a very specific plan in their minds of what they want to do. So they have a direction of travel. It's not a McKinsey PowerPoint chart as such, but they do have a plan. It's completely wrong to say that what's happening right now is random. It's not. There's a pattern. Trump, as a king, has a set of instincts and a vague sense of where he wants to go, but he certainly doesn't have a McKinsey PowerPoint chart. And although some of the people around him are ideologues with a very strong conviction about what policies are needed, Trump is fundamentally transactional and is basically both being used by the ideologues and is using the ideologues for his own, if you like, aggrandizement, his own sort of power politics. And this pattern is absolutely riddled with what one person who's close to the White House says, industrial level grift, in the sense that people who want to get special deals are, clustering around the courtiers, much again like the court of King Henry VIII or Louis XIV, and trying to buy favors. Right now, getting exemptions is something which is definitely being sold, along with pardons and things like that. And other countries that are looking to come and try and do business with Trump are expected to come in the manner of a royal kingdom and essentially give tributes and display their subservient position, or look so incredibly powerful that kingdom to kingdom, king to king, you negotiate. But that is a pattern that I see, and you have this bitter irony of an administration that has within its ranks the ability to embrace 21st century technology and AI, with people like Elon Musk and many people who are passionately in favor of it, coupled with a governance model that many of us associate more with, frankly, the pre-industrial era in the West than the 21st century.
Excellent. Hail the king. Alex.
Well, I mean, I would agree with 2 points. One is that one of the most dangerous weapons in the world is a PowerPoint from any consulting firm. Be very careful. Be very careful sometimes. And the other is that I think the new administration, the current administration, had a plan. I mean, this is very detailed. I think it's pretty well known. I don't know how many thousands of pages, but I think it is being executed. But aside from the politics, the personality, the proximity, all of which are very important context to what's going on, I think the question, from my perspective, is what do you do about it? Obviously, we see in the newspapers every day how each country, depending on their position, are higher levels of retaliation, pre-signaling concessions, et cetera. So that's one aspect of it. But from, let's say, you're running a company, a big company, multinational company, or maybe it's multi-domestic only. What I've seen is that the elevation of what used to be called the government affairs, investor relations department, has now become much higher in the C-suite, direct report to the CEO and the board, with more powers, engaged in war planning, tariff rooms, retaliation against their competitors, customer pricing strategy. So there's an elevation of that role because lobbying and advocacy now takes on a new role. You have to know who you're dealing with because regulation is now maybe at the whim of personality a little bit more than sort of stated agreements, NATO, this and that. The other piece is the elevation of, I would say, core strategy. These are fundamental questions that companies now need to ask. Do we want to be in the other 60% of the $100 trillion world? Why don't we have a bigger export markets in ASEAN or the Middle East or Africa? Do we need to rationalize our distributing network in the United States? For venture capital funds and investors, cash. How are we going to fund the exit? We can't keep all our companies operating. There are different burn rates. There are different levels of maturity and exit. There are different levels of competitiveness. There's going to be a rationalization, a natural portfolio reallocation of cash. Where are you going to get the cash? That's a whole other question, which gets into the sort of cost of money and interest rates and the things that make the administration twitchy, which is bond yields, price of money. If that goes up, that's very scary for a lot of investment. And we already see the investment market's frozen. So that's what's happening. The investor markets, the banks are also conserving, pausing, freezing, and looking at their portfolio and fixing the existing companies that they have. Yeah. So whatever you're in a portfolio company or you're investing in, I mean, that's the core strategy that has now come back into the boardrooms and the decision makers. Yeah,
and this is interesting. And Gillian, I wanted to ask you on this. It's no longer what you know, it is who you know, if it becomes a court system. Now, this is great for Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, because at JP Morgan, as a big company, I can hire all sorts of people who know all sorts of people to do this. But it's terrifying for you and I setting up a startup, no matter how smart we are, because if we have to buy favors in order to get market share, to get proof and evidence of the product market fit, if this now is subject to an additional tax in the sense of that I need to buy favors from the regulators to actually break into that market, is there a risk that the whole model of venture capital innovation is being squashed by this new court system that is being introduced? Gillian?
No, we don't know yet because, bear in mind, we've not even had 100 days of Trump yet. We don't know whether this approach will remain in place for 4 years. We don't know. There are plenty of things that could derail this. And we just don't know how the wider system is going to respond right now. That just is the reality. That's not me ducking out of the question at all. And by the way, I would add to the list of issues you've raised that, as you may know, the Trump administration is shuttering many of the statistics and websites in the system. One of the ones that appears to be attacking right now is a patent web page and portal. And that, of course, is pretty critical for many startups because that's where you protect your IP rights and things. And anyone who's involved in university life, which I spend half my time doing, knows all about the current assault on science and scientific research, but also about the fact that attacks on the portal for patents potentially undermines scientists' confidence in creating startups when they want to actually use this intellectual capital for commercial reasons. So those omens are pretty negative. And the general freeze right now on lending and business activity is also pretty negative. And one of the many bitter ironies around the first, less than 100 days is that this is an administration which came to power pledging to get rid of the administration and the incumbents, and was backed by many people in Silicon Valley precisely because of that. But as you say, Jesper, may actually end up reinforcing the position of incumbents rather than undermining it. But having said all that, I have enormous faith in both the ability of social systems to adapt, for businesses to find ways to make money, for brave entrepreneurs to creep around between the cracks and to create businesses that can thrive. And again, as an anthropologist, having the perspective which doesn't necessarily react with pearl-clutching horror to changes, but tries to look at things within a grand sweep of history and recognize that there are numerous epistemologies out there. There are numerous ways of organizing power. I regard this as a shift, which certainly looks pretty negative to me, trained in late 20th century democratic capitalism, but may neither be permanent nor necessarily entirely bad in all respects. There are aspects which may be good in terms of what's happening right now. And yes, I believe there will be opportunities for entrepreneurs, but they're going to have to be very nimble, broad-minded, read history, and frankly, a bit of anthropology as well.
There you go. Now you don't just have to learn how to code and read a financial statement. Now you have to study history and do anthropology as well. It's getting more complicated, but that's okay because your AI is going to help you along the way. Now, Margot, you guys are at the sort of frontier as a PR firm. My dealings with my customers, with my suppliers, the entire, multi-stakeholder system is being revolutionized at light speed because of AI, because it's no longer search, it's now Claude or whatever they are called, that I have to please. Plus, you've got this change in government relations. Talk to me a little bit about how you guys, as one of the leading firms, sort of cope with this sort of, forces coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, from a communications perspective, there has been a significant change in the last few years in our recommended approach to our clients. First is, totally agree, it's the rise of sort of LLMs and the information coming through LLMs. So whether you're getting information from ChatGPT, from Claude, you really have to ensure that for your company, for your reputation, for your personal reputation, you're actually thinking about how to optimize the information that will come through an LLM, rather than just thinking about it from search, which is what we had before. And so, there in particular, earned media is actually something that LLMs draw from pretty significantly. And so actually then optimizing the footprint that you have through earned media actually in some ways becomes even more important. Content from trusted sources is actually, even more important than ever because that's what feeds those algorithms. At the same time, sort of, Jillian, going back to your sort of dispersion of authority, yes, journalists absolutely matter, but there's a whole sort of rise of influencers. Anybody can really be a journalist today. And then what we've also found is that sort of folks who used to be at, the Financial Times or were at Forbes or Fortune, they've sort of gone off separately and they've created their own Substacks, they've created their own media brands. And so there's sort of that rise of sort of the, media influencer that's increasingly important as well. And that's a group that, in particular when covering AI, it's important to get in front of them too. And then, of course, there's been sort of a rise of, the continued need for sort of a person like yourself, sort of that validation from the employee. So again, it's sort of that more trust is local, trust comes from my community versus top down from the CEO, as Jillian said.
Right. So I wish for you to start preparing the questions that you have. I'm going to ask one more questions to the panel, each of you, and German rules apply, which means that it's kind of like a lightning round. You're going to have to reply, in relatively brief time. No, you are first. I'm looking at you, to set the piece. If you had, a minute or 2 minutes with President Trump, what's the one or two things that you would like him to do? And I go with you first.
Listen actively. Look at the broader set of implications. For example, goods versus services. That's a huge one. In terms of managing a surplus, giving and taking to be able to manage the goods down, et cetera. I think the push for countries to be more self-sufficient in many ways, whatever it's their raw materials, whether it's their people training, whether it's their national defense, I think that's probably something else. So I would say just keep a balanced listening viewpoint to all the things you're going to discover in this giant maximum force negotiation process.
Okay. Jillian?
Move fast and break things works well sometimes with private sector companies. It can be quite dangerous with government because by moving fast and breaking things, you might remove a lot of the know-how in government that's needed. And somebody like Michael Lewis, the author of the Fifth Risk, has noted. And it may also smash apart global supply chains and financial chains of trust, which cannot easily be rebuilt. So rapid experimentation in the private sector is fantastic. Experimentation on a micro level within the government sector can work often. Doing it on a macro level is potentially going to backfire very badly.
Good.
Sure. I mean, I personally, just having been out in Silicon Valley for a long time, found Trump's embrace of innovation and pro-innovation policies very exciting. And I do think it's, in reading the news at least, it seems like there's a schism between sort of those who are pro-innovation, pro-free trade, and those who are not. So I think my advice would be maybe lean towards those who are pro-innovation and pro-free trade and continue to be in that camp.
So it's very interesting. Is this off the record? Okay, in the...
I'm not convinced there is such a thing as off the record anymore, Jesper, in a world of instant media communications.
But there's the fake...
I would agree with that, Jillian, as the PR person on the stage. I would say no such thing.
No, it's interesting. I had the privilege of briefing some of the Japanese team that went to negotiate with Trump yesterday. And, okay, so how far are you going to go? Because, trust we talk about. Okay, let's be real. There's, of course, the military stuff. Is America really going to defend Japan if push comes to shove? Is America really going to put boots on the ground to defend Taiwan, which is next to them? And there's that aspect, and be my guest. Think about it in more practical terms. Trust. Trust manifests itself in money. Where do you keep your money? Where do you keep your reserves? And it represents itself, where do you keep your data, right? So, dear Japan, are you in a position to shift your reserves? You have $1.3 trillion of foreign currency reserves, right? Are you going to shift them away from being entrusted by JP Morgan and other American banks to the Bank of China? Are you going to do that? Your data Japan runs a digital deficit now of slightly more than 1% of GDP. That's basically all the cloud and data services where America has a de facto monopoly, because you can't go anywhere but AWS and the other three cloud providers. Are you really going to shift your data from being entrusted by an American corporation to a Chinese corporation? It's very interesting, right? Because when you think about it in terms of a power play, which is obviously what Mr. Trump is spectacularly good at, I do hold all the cards in terms of how trust actually manifests itself. It is the American dominance, because at this particular moment in time, the People's Republic of China, which is the big alternative, right, just is not there. And the question is whether it's Japan, whether it is Germany, whether it is Poland, will you have the capacity to actually build your own independent system of data storage and data management, right? Will you be able to develop and break into the dominance that AI has been created by American corporations? These are some of the questions that obviously we have to deal with, but I wanted to reach out to you. And, for the wonderful panel, if you've got any specific questions or any commentary, please do. German rules apply. It has to be a question, even to you, Hori-san. The German rule is the question has to be within 30 seconds. And if you go over, you buy a bottle of champagne for all of the panelists and a magnum for Jillian.
The simple question is that what would you advise to business leader in this era of Trump and AI? One advice each from consultant and also PR and also media.
Okay, dozo. Anybody?
Stay calm, take a long-term perspective, recognize that the patterns of trust have changed from vertical to horizontal, as Margot already pointed out. And also try to use your imagination to realize all the different ways that the world has been organized in the past and all the ways that that could change going forward. And the last point I'll make is that one way to understand what's happened in the last 150 years is we've gone through several big zeitgeist shifts around economics. We had the pre-1914 period of imperial capitalism. Then we had the interwar period of nationalist economics. Then we had Keynesian economics. Then we had neoliberal economics. We're now seeing something else, which we don't yet really have a name for. I don't think the pendulum's going to swing back. This doesn't mean that stakeholderism is dead. All the ESG stuff, as Margot says, might seem like it's in retreat politically, but it still matters in terms of how companies run their operations. They just have to deal with different stakeholders today, including the government and national security interests.
Thank you.
I mean, I agree with sort of everything Jillian said, and from a communications perspective, I think sort of three things. Focus on your business. Focus on how what you're doing enables you to run a stronger business, run a more efficient business, but really focus on anything you talk about, how it ladders back to your bottom line of your business. I think secondly, really focus on innovation. Talk about how you're innovating for the future. Talk about how you're leveraging AI. Really, again, sort of focus on the future and innovating. And then lastly, I think focus on employees and community, which again sort of ties back into the running of the business. But for your employees, they're facing sort of a world in which perhaps the skills they have might be obsolete. So how are you thinking about retraining your employees to adapt to the world of AI? And then how are you sort of continuing to invest in the local communities in which you operate? And that doesn't just mean where you have your headquarters. If, for example, you're building out data centers, how are you actually in some ways sort of making the communities in which those operate stronger as well?
I mean, I agree with my fellow panelists. I think I would encourage and I have encouraged my clients to use this opportunity as an opportunity to reinvent at scale and with urgency their business. It's about Darwinian. We talked about that analogy, adapting. You can look your customers, your supply chain, your data, your partners, your pricing, your competitive set, your alliances. This is an opportunity to reinvent your business for the future because it's a different world now. This is not the way it was. That's not going to change. So hoping it will change is not a strategy.
So the one advice, focus on your team. This is a world of uncertainty. Your team is your most important asset. And the stronger you as a leader now interact with your team, the greater confidence and the greater the reward is going to be. Because also what will happen is your ability to attract talent that you couldn't reach in the past, right? Now that people are scared, the liquidity in the labor market, the market for talent, not just for coders, but across all the strategic positions, now has become much more fluid. And as a result of that, you as a leader, you can actually attract that by focusing even more on building your own distinct leadership culture within your firm. Next question. Whoops, please.
Thank you very much. This may be more for Gillian than for anyone else. One of the reasons that the current regime has come to power is because of instilling lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in other people. You always see in this transactional nature of things that the other side is not trustable. Does Japan offer any particular ways to help us restore trust in the other side?
I think Japan offers 3 lessons. One is that Japanese culture is deeply aware of resource constraint and about the need to share pain when a society faces pain collectively. And that is a lesson that I think that America is going to have to learn, and elsewhere in the West. Secondly, leading out of this, there's a strong sense of being a steward in Japan, which again I think is something which needs more emphasis today, particularly discussing the environmental issues, which by the way can be bipartisan in nature. And thirdly, Japanese corporate world exists through stakeholderism. It always has. It never really believed in Milton Friedman for a millisecond. And as I said earlier, I think stakeholderism is alive and well, even though the Republican Party is rejecting ESG-style stakeholderism. They're introducing a different type of stakeholderism, and that is a type of stakeholderism that frankly has always been there in the Japanese psyche in the post-World War II era. So I think those are some of the lessons. Yes, we may have a very different view.
I just have one add, very practical. I think that the Nippon Steel, US Steel bid is at the very core of whether Trump actually is constructively a deal maker, right? Because it's from all perspectives, we can talk about it offline, it's a win-win situation, but it's been blocked for whatever reasons. Show me that there is a constructive way forward. This will become absolute key over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Any question over there, please? I will come to you in a second.
Okay.
Yep, go ahead.
Great. Very simple question. In your final remarks, you made it sound like the advice was capitulation to the Japanese, and I don't think that was your intention. A bully exists in the White House, and most are choosing not to capitulate, or to capitulate. Harvard is choosing not to. China is choosing not to. For businesses that don't have the same kind of power as those corporations and governments, where do you advise us to draw the line?
I think just keep the path and keep the faith. I mean, the nice thing is Japan is setting the example by not rushing. There's no urgency. We've got plenty of reserves, whether it's at the corporate level, whether it's at the government level. There is no rush deal making that is coming through. The urgency to develop your own independent data, financial, trust systems that can capture this is very, very strong. And as a result of that, you see an actually, you've never seen a pickup in the corporate metabolism in Japan right now. Your ability to make deals in Japan, to find partners, has never been better. And because of the reality of Japan no longer being able to trust the United States of America, not being able to trust the People's Republic of China, now, when the tough get going, the going gets tough, the corporate metabolism, industrial reorganization, and the opportunity for you to actually partner up with a major Japanese player to scale up in the Japanese market. This year, 2025, is the best year in the history of the world outside of 1954, right, where you can actually do this. So it's a very hopeful message. Go ahead, Jim.
Can I add one practical thing there, which is I think it's really critical for people who want to not capitulate, and I should say kudos to those who don't, to try and create allies and work as a group. Because the way that the Trump administration is operating, to go back to the royal court metaphor, is to pick people off one by one. And we've seen that in the law, amongst law firms. We're seeing it been seeing it to date amongst universities and amongst media groups. And as someone who knows a lot about the university side of things, it's very striking that until Harvard's action, essentially the model was that he was picking off the Ivies one by one, and the Ivy League universities, generally speaking, have not been collaborating because they were proud and competitive and scared, and they all thought they could buy off the administration even if it hit the others. The only people who've been capitulating amongst universities have been one or two notches down, where there actually is a lot of organization going on now amongst the tiny notch below Ivy League universities. And I won't speak about that now, but I really admire what a lot of the slightly non-Ivy League universities are now doing to support each other. What Harvard's done this week may be the beginning, I think, of a turning point. We've seen Stanford and Princeton and others come out and support, but there needs to be collaboration, coordination, and people need to put aside their competitive instincts and their desire to be part of those courtiers buying off individual deals and work together if they do want to chart a different course or challenge what's going on.
Good. Young lady.
Thank you. So, is this on? Hello? Can you guys hear me? Thank you very much. This question is probably more for Alex. What you mentioned about companies needing to balance between being agile in the short term and the long term really resonated with me. So I serve on a few public company boards here in the US, and actually I just came back from NASDAQ yesterday. We had a meeting, about 350 board members, and what's interesting, 85% said they're waiting and seeing. They just wait and see. About 10% said they are planning to do something. Maybe about 5% has decided to do something. And so I would love to get your perspective with regards to how do you balance between that short term and long term? As you know, capital allocation decisions are very long term, where things change every 6 hours or every day.
Yeah, you've heard the analogy about bankruptcy. It happens slowly and then all of a sudden. There's an analogy to the current world, which is a lot of the stuff that boards have been asked to deal with and CEO teams in the last few years it's always been there. How do we embed analytics and advanced AI, Gen AI, whatever the next generation beyond that, into our core operations, functionally, horizontally, et cetera? How do we make sure that our supply chains are digital and two-way and sustainable? How do we keep the right leadership teams and culture and purpose that will drive us together as a unified global company or domestic company, et cetera? So I would say that to the boards, these are things that you had to fix already. And you were probably you grade yourself A, B, C, D, E on that. Again, CEOs have very little time to prove themselves. This is another testing moment, whether they can meet the challenge. I think there'll be a lot of CEO turnover now. It'll accelerate. Boards will be unhappy, and boards will be shifted, and there will be companies that are divested and so on. So there's a whole level after the pause, the investment pause, the CapEx pause. That's happening. But then there will be a flurry of restructuring by sector. I mean, obviously, you look at the tariffs and all that. So there's pharmaceuticals, consumer goods, semiconductors, high tech, medium tech, defense tech. So I would just say you're right. Balancing the short term and long term is what CEOs have to be, that's what they're paid to do. But the problem with the CEO teams that I've seen is that they focus so much on the practical stuff, like the near-term stuff, or do-nothing stuff, and then, or so far out that, that's the third CEO after them that will have to deal with it, right? Like the climate change initiatives. It's the middle ground where you can show progress against the long-term plan, I think. So anyway, it's an incomplete answer. I mean, it's a tough, each company is different, the history is different, the risk factors are different, the pain points are different, but and their success and credibility with the CEO team is different too. So happy to talk about it afterwards about how you're looking at that.
I mean, for 30 seconds, I think that, this catalyst that is being forced, right? You now have no choice. You're right. Of course, the practical answer is, well, let's wait and see. ちょっと待ってください。ちょっと我慢しましょう, right? But this is actually not an option because you do have the center of the universe, the United States of America, changing, forcing you to change. You've got technology changing, forcing you to change. And so actually the positive thing is, just as in my home country, Germany, right? The reality, whatever you think of Vice President Vance, the reality that his speech at the Munich NATO summit was a catalyst for long overdue action to be taken in Germany. Right? And that's the same at the corporate level, right? And everything is different, case by case, you need to analyze it, but this is a time where business as usual is no longer an option. And that, I think, is where the leadership quality now really is going to start to come through. Your fight is going to get harder. And just as, God bless him, the old ex-Prime Minister Abe, when Trump got elected first, what did they do? They rolled up their sleeves and said, how do we engage? And this is the step that needs to be taken. Just as Masayoshi Son from SoftBank, right? What did he do? Within 30 seconds of the Trump regime, he sets up Stargate, $500 billion of committed investment led by SoftBank, by a Japanese company, to show a positive way on how to enact with this GPLP structure that they've put together, focused on AI, but it is a working thing. It was the last time that you genuinely saw what's the name of the guy? Well, President Trump actually smiling on TV, was when he met Masayoshi Son. Another question. We've got time for one more, please.
I would like to follow up Jasper's question with this de-dollarization. Given the trust to the U.S. are compromised, is this de-dollarization a long-term trend? If yes, what are the alternatives? Commodity-based, gold-based, Bitcoin-based, or bucket of different currencies? Thank you.
Gillian, over to you. De-dollarization.
At the moment, there are no clear-cut alternatives. It's very fragmented, the alternatives. And that's not surprising because if you look back at history, there have been 6 reserve currencies over history. They've always gone hand in hand with military power and economic and political dominance. They've never lasted forever. And whenever you have one dominant hegemon essentially losing their power, what you tend to have is a rather nasty limbo period when you're kind of almost between regimes. And I suspect we may, and I stress may, be sliding very slowly towards that, given what the Trump administration has done to shatter confidence around the world and shatter trust more than anything else. This is another bitter irony because if you look at the source of America's hegemonic power today, it's not manufacturing, it's finance and the dollar-based system. The Trump administration say they want to hang on to that, and yet they are inadvertently undermining it. So I don't see a rapid switch away from the dollar, but I do see stealthy questioning and loss of trust and a potential hunt for alternatives to hedge. And we don't know whether that will end up actually blossoming into a proper alternative. But what you can be sure of, and I'm quite skeptical that there will be an alternative anytime soon, but you can certainly bet your bottom dollar, and it is still the dollar, you can bet your bottom dollar that people are trying to imagine alternatives now.
So it's very interesting. I call it the MAGA discount, right? Because now...
Discount. They call it in Britain more on discount.
But it's very interesting, right? The American capital market is the only capital market is I have to deploy $10 billion, right? Which if I'm a pension fund, that's chump change, right? If I have to deploy $10 billion, the only capital market I can do that in without significantly impacting price is the United States of America. Because whether it's fixed income, whether it's credit, whether it's equities, you name it, the market is deep, the market is broad. An alternative simply does not exist. If you ask me to employ even $1 billion in the Japanese capital market, I'm immediately in fixed income, in credit certainly, as well as in equities, I'm moving the price. So it's not a liquid alternative. And the other Asian markets don't compare, right? So the alternative could be the People's Republic of China opening its capital account and actually deepening its market by issuing a shitload, technical term, of debt, right? So that we could actually do this. But there is reasons that we can talk about in the People's Republic of China for why the last thing you're going to be able to do is to actually open your capital account, because probably the currency would collapse. Because you know what is the difference between Japan and China? In Japan, everybody stays in and wants to stay in. In China, everybody wants to get out. We've run out of time. We'll have more discussions. I think you've got phenomenal sessions laid up here. We've got the lunch working sessions, and then we've got the closing session. And then most importantly, Hori-san has promised that at the cocktail event afterwards, he's going to dance on a table. So, if you need an example of Pax Nipponica, Hori-san dancing on the table, this is why you should all come and invest and engage with Japan as the great alternative. Jillian, I want to thank you so much for piping in. Where are you actually, in London? Or where?
No, I'm in New York.
You're in New York. Okay, well, that's perfectly fine.
And can I say to everyone there, I guess the biggest conclusion of this whole discussion has been
there you go. Excellent. Margot, thank you so much. And Alex, fantastic. Thank you. And I want to thank the audience. Thank you very much.